listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio, and at the same time, why don't you come on over to my YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast right here on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the live chat room, which is already starting up over there. It's just going to get better and more occupied and more busy as the minutes commence. If you're new to the chat room, come on over and introduce yourself. Everybody will say hi. Everybody will be happy to have you and join you into the conversation. I'm talking too fast. I'm slurring. I've got one of those stupid little sores on the side of my tongue. One of the canker sores. Or I bit my tongue or something. And so I'm slurring. It's kind of more like talking like this, except it's not so bad yet. So that's what's going on right now. And I've got advice. Whenever you do a radio show, don't ever come and start doing your radio show after coming off a movie that made you cry at the end. That's why I had to give myself a few minutes. It wasn't like a blubbery cry or anything like that. It was moving. You want to see a good movie? I will recommend News of the World with Tom Hanks. And it takes place in the Old West, and he comes across a lost girl, blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who had grown up for several years with the Kiowa Indians. And it's a very good movie. And it ended with, it's kind of happy tears. You don't always cry because of tragedy. Sometimes it's something really cool that happens, or it strikes a chord with you. And it kind of left me that way. So, still a little on the misty edge of things. But, and of course my kids learn from my wife very easily. My 9-year-old daughter goes, "Are you crying?" And I'm like, "Shut up, I'm trying to hear the end of the movie." So that's where that happens. So I wasn't blubbering. It wasn't sadness. It was a very good movie, and it evokes a lot of emotion. So there you go. Let me take a sip of coffee on that one. Well, it's not coffee, but it's Gatorade. Electrolytes, Now, before we really get started, I had mentioned this book. I've started reading this, and I'm reading it rather slowly. It's my library room fare, if you get my meaning with that. So you get to read about a chapter a day. And it's Matthew McConaughey's memoirs. Now, he's only 50 years old, but this is his brand new book. It's called Green Lights. And it was a New York Times bestseller. I kind of told you about this book a little while back, and a week or two ago. And I started reading his book in earnest this morning. I read the introduction, and I think I either read that first page to you, his little foreword, a couple of weeks ago. And I wanted to read to you just to show you what this book is like. I'd heard lots of good things about it, that this was a good book. And so I thought, let's take a look at it. And I started reading it. And I'm trying to see if I wanted to read for you his first chapter here. And it's not really the chapter, because it's not really the first part of the book. Part 1 starts after this. And but he says this. He says right here, he says, "What's a green light?" He named the book Green Lights. And this is after his personal foreword, and then another couple of pages of foreword matter, and then he hits this, then it goes into part 1 of the book. He says, "Green lights mean go, advance, carry on, continue. On the road, they're set up to give the flow of traffic." Hang on a second, folks. I hate to do this, but I have got to put on my glasses. Captain Kirk in The Wrath of Khan. Damn. And then he puts his glasses on. Okay. On the road, they're set up to give the flow of traffic the right of way, and when scheduled properly, more vehicles catch more green lights in succession. They say, proceed. In our lives, they're an affirmation of our way. They're approvals, support, praise, gifts, gas on our fire, attaboys and appetites. They're cash money, birth, springtime, health, success, joy, sustainability, innocence, and fresh starts. We love green lights. They don't interfere with our direction. They're easy. They're a shoeless summer. They say and give us what we want. Green lights can also be distinguished as yellow and red lights. A caution, a detour, a thoughtful pause, an interruption, a disagreement, indigestion, sickness, and pain. A full stop, a jackknife, an intervention, a failure, a suffering, a slap in the face, death. We don't like yellow and red lights. They slow us down or stop our flow. They're hard. They're a shoeless winter. They say no, but sometimes give us what we need. Catching green lights is about skill, intent, context, consideration, endurance, anticipation, resilience, speed, and discipline. We can catch more green lights by simply identifying where the red lights are in our life, and then change course to hit fewer of them. We can also earn green lights, engineer and design for them. We can create more and schedule them in our future, a path of least resistance. Through force of will, hard work, and the choices we make. We can be responsible for green lights. Catching green lights is also about timing, the world's timing and ours. When we're in a zone or on the frequency and with the flow, we can catch green lights by sheer luck because we're in the right place at the right time. Catching more of them in our future can be about intuition, karma, and fortune. Sometimes catching green lights is about fate. Navigating the autobahn of life in the best way possible is about getting relative with the inevitable at the right time. The inevitability of a situation is not relative when we accept the outcome of a given situation as inevitable. Then how we choose to deal with it is relative. We either persist and continue in our present pursuit of desired result, pivot and take a new tack to get to it, or concede altogether and tally up for fate. We push on, call an audible, or wave the white flag and live to fight another day. The secret to our satisfaction lies in which one of these we choose to do when. This is the art of living. I believe everything we do in life is part of a plan. Sometimes the plan goes as intended, sometimes it doesn't. That's part of the plan. Realizing this is a green life in and of itself. The problems we face today eventually turn into blessings in the rearview mirror of life. In time, yesterday's red lights lead us to a green light. All destruction eventually leads to construction. All death eventually leads to birth. All pain eventually leads to pleasure. In this life or in the next, what goes down will come up. It's a matter of how we see the challenge in front of us and how we engage with it. Persist, pivot, or concede. It's up to us. It's our choice every time. This is a book about how to catch more yeses in a world of no's. How to recognize when a no might actually be a yes. This is a book about catching green lights and realizing that the yellows and the reds eventually turn green. Green lights. By design and on purpose. Good luck, he ends that with. And he's got a little, what he calls in this book his bumper stickers. Picture of it taped on here. It says, if all that I would want to do would be to sit and talk to you Would you listen? And he wrote that when he was age 12. He's got it in the book here. So, green lights. Life is all about looking for the green lights and making the green lights work. This is the secret, I think, to a successful life and a happy life. And so I'm finding this to be a very good book. Again, if you want to find it, I picked mine up for $21 at Walmart. It's a brand new book by Matthew McConaughey called Green Lights. And it's number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. So there you go. There's a good book recommendation for you. Uh-oh. We got police next door in a neighborhood where we don't get a lot of police. So it's interesting. Rainey was sitting here and she saw them out the window, so she bolted up to see what's going on. There's excitement. There's news. Let me take a sip and let's get into talking about the serpent again. Now, hope you're enjoying what we started last night. It's a little controversial. It's only controversial because it deals with spirituality. We've got people who will say, I don't think about God. I don't think about all that stuff. I know, I don't know exactly, not to misquote you, Field Guy, over in our chat room, but last night you said something about, and you've said it before, religion doesn't do anything for you, so you don't think much on it. Let's take this out of the category of religion, even though it deals with a topic that we find in religion, and let's look at it from a spiritual standpoint. Let's examine this topic from a little different aspect than maybe we have done in the past. And we left off last night, and we were talking a bit about this whole idea of the Gnostic insights that raged and grinned so against the more traditional readings of Genesis, more traditional readings about Jesus. The modern study of religion can help us to recognize the wisdom of the serpent, or the gift that was left to us by the serpent. And at the same time, it helps us understand that there seemed to be a jealousy with the God. Is that flipping it around too much for some of you? Does that mess with your religious sensibilities? Perhaps that's what Field Guy meant over in the chat room. Doesn't mess with his sensibilities because he doesn't have any regarding this stuff. But any of you that may have this kind of thing, where you think, I was raised this way, or I believed this way, or I don't know what to believe, does that mess with your sensibilities? It's not really meant to do that. It's meant to ask you to question the things that you say you believe. And maybe step outside the box and look at things a different way. It's like I've mentioned this before in talking about some of my other writings, my other books, is that I have a very dear old friend of mine, Dr. Charles Ailing. He was one of my seminary professors. But he was also the man that first led me into understanding at age 11 about the history of Moses. I call him Senenmut. He didn't use that name back then, but he talked with me about the pharaohs of the day. And, of course, that led up into my historical studies and eventually into my seminary training. But he told me at one time, he says, Scott, whenever you're looking into history, you've got to make sure you filter your history through the biblical text. Now, I understand what he meant. He meant if you are a person of faith and this is your book of faith, anything you encounter out there, from social stuff to historical stuff, filter it through your faith and through the book of your faith to see if you think it meets up with what we've learned there. And I asked him at that time, wouldn't it be a better thing to step outside of the box of faith and look back in? And so in essence, that's what we're going to be doing with this little series talking about the serpent, the whole serpent's gift, the Gnostic reflections of religious studies from biblical topics. And so I want to move into faith and reason and gnosis. Gnosis being a word for knowledge, which I talked about last night. This is where we're going to go today. We're going to need more informed cultural memories as we step into faith and reason and gnosis, and more bold intellectual and imaginative practices to recognize, accept, and then act upon this gift of the serpent. What did we say yesterday was the gift of the serpent? Do you remember? This whole gift, and he's not talking about, here, I am the serpent, I give you this gift. No, he's saying the outcome of what that story was actually all about in the Garden of Eden. The encounter with the serpent was sexuality. It was the eyes opened. It was the nakedness recognized. It was the God, the Elohim, that did not want his creation to go any further, to learn that knowledge. And we established that in the mythology. And so, and it's like I say, I was in an interview yesterday for a different radio program, and we talked for 2 hours. And we talked about this particularly. They were asking me questions about the reptilians, and of course got into a lot of the stuff that we've talked about on this show. And I said, inevitably, there are things that sound goofy to me. There are stories and mythologies, even biblical stories, time-honored, traditional, our own personal history-honored acceptance of certain stories. Yet when you step outside the box and you look back in, they sound really goofy sometimes, wacky even. And I say, this is what I do when I come to stories that sound goofy or sound wacky, or I've gone off the deep end, or I talk about this about aliens, or that about Bigfoot, or this about the Bible, and so on and so forth. If it sounds a little too wacky, I like to personally take a step back and say, look, we are a society that says we believe things because we reason them through and we think them out. And so whenever I get to that too much of a fringe element in something that I'm talking about, or whenever something seems a bit too wacky, I like to step back from it and say, let's look at this from this angle. Let's examine this myth. Let's examine this story. Let's take a closer look at this fable so we can deuce it out, so to speak. And so there were a couple of, there was a historian of Gnosticism, Giles Kispel, and he was a friend of Carl Jung, who we've mentioned before, who was a contemporary of Freud. And it's once noted that there are 3 major strands of Western culture. There's faith, that's number 1. That's a way of knowing the world and oneself via religious doctrines, themselves dependent upon divine revelation and authoritative creeds of the religious communities. That's faith. The second one is reason. It's a form of knowledge deriving, at least in the West, from Greek philosophy, a logic that relies on this analytic and linear thought, empirical sense data, so to speak. Just the facts, man. And doubt, there's plenty of doubt in that, to arrive at the objective truth of things. And it's in this form of knowledge, of course, that culminated in the scientific method. This is where Richard Feynman said to doubt, he says, that's, to me, that's the way it is. He was an astrophysicist, a contemporary of Oppenheimer and Einstein. Quoted him before. He says, I doubt, and when I doubt, I question. He says, and when I question, he says, well, I kind of think that's the way things are made. That's how we get to our answers, by doubting and questioning. And so this is what reason is. It's doubting and questioning. And then there was faith, there's reason, and then there's gnosis. We call this knowing something. When I tell people I am a committed agnostic, it means I am committed to gnosis. I don't know nothing. In other words, I have no solid answers for anything until I get philosophical. But that's my reasoning. That's my doubt and my questioning. So gnosis is knowledge. That's the third form. It's a form of intuitive, visionary, or mystical knowledge that privileges the primacy of personal experience and the depths of self over the claims of both faith and reason. Traditionally, in order to acquire some form of liberation or salvation from a world seen as corrupt or fallen. So gnosis, knowledge, is that thing that rises to its primacy in our lives because of our personal experiences, our personal digging things out and reasoning things out. It's the depth of self over the claims of both faith and reason. So those are the three things, those three areas, those major strands of Western culture: faith, reason, and gnosis. So historically speaking, the study of religion itself arose from the experience of faith and the desire to explain and codify its content for a different generation. As faith sought understanding, as theology, it also encountered serious questions that, when honestly pursued to their end, affected permanent revolutions in both thought and belief. And among those problems, four that were encountered in a particularly acute way in the 19th century, especially within the European Protestant universities, and further radicalized in the 20th century, this time in the United States, they stand out as a particular definitive for us today. One, the historical construction of all Scripture. That's what we had in my evangelical faith circles in the conservative Baptist settings. This historical construction of all Scripture. Two, the radical religious pluralism of humanity. The radical religious pluralism of humanity. You get that? Humanity is radically pluralistic in its religious belief. Number three, the incompatibility of particular religiosities with modern science. You've seen that. You want to see two steam locomotives heading toward each other on the same track? Call one faith, call the other one science. They are in a head-on collision course all the time. And then four, of course, the role of gender and the place of women within religious traditions. And finally, there's kind of a fifth that you could throw in at the end here. It's more recently taken center stage, and that's the relationship between religious authority, community, and violence. So, these are some real earmarks of religion within our society today. And I don't want to take this any further right now because we're really at the end of the first segment and very little time left. Too little time to start forging ahead a little deeper. So let's save that for the second segment. Folks, you're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, and also on my YouTube channel's live simulcast at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over and hit the join button there, by the way. See 3 ways you can become a member of this show. So thanks for sitting here and waiting. You're going to have to wait, or sitting here and listening. You're going to have to wait now for a couple of minutes as we go out to break. Sit tight. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, folks, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. And this, of course, is our second segment of tonight's show. It's Friday, end of the week Friday. And I don't know what your Fridays look like, but mine it's all the same these days. Oh, and by the way, we're also simulcasting this program in video over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the live chat room of fellow Intrepids. Join the conversation, which is going headstrong right now, down the rails. So join us and come on in. Be a voyeur and watch, or come on in and join the conversation. And I am currently, by the way, I am now in a COVID household. I am officially, as of midnight last night, out of quarantine. I survived COVID, and you've all seen little bits and pieces of me along the way. I weathered it pretty well for having the trifecta of susceptibility. Being 60 years old, having diabetes, and having heart disease. I survived COVID just fine. Headache, felt like I got hit by a truck for a couple of days, but never anything that was life debilitating. Other than, unless you call sleeping on the sofa for 5 days straight, life debilitating. I did get to watch more TV. So, I'm out of it, but alas, my wife Rainey has exactly what I had a week ago Monday. And that started with her about 3 days ago, and she got her test back today. She's got COVID, but she's up around doing stuff. She got up early and dragged the trash down to this curb in the 20-degree weather this morning. And she came in and I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I can do that, you know." And she said, "Shut up, I'm having my period too, so I'll do whatever I damn well want." I'm like, "Okay." I bow to. So, and then my young 11-year-old son also has it. But it's debilitating him in such a way that he's still sitting playing video games all day and yelling at his sisters. So the two little girls seem to be coasting pretty free. And now we'll move on. We left off talking about several different things about faith in our society, faith in our culture. And, you know, once faith began to question its own foundations and realize how unstable these foundations truly were, it was only a matter of time before reason separated entirely from its religious roots, and it sought its own integrity and its own honest conclusions. The age of reason started because of religion, because of faith, but it totally separated itself out. And the philosophers knew, or had led the way here. And indeed, the 18th and the early 19th centuries had known a whole series of intellectuals, those whose thoughts both witnessed to and helped affect what amounted to a culturally shared, altered state of consciousness. Or what we today call, quite appropriately, I think, the Enlightenment. And now, within such an altered state, what was once common knowledge or inviolable sacred truth now became deeply questionable, if not actually at times overtly silly. So the things we held dear on a faith level became rather hard to reconcile reasonably with things that we knew to be factual and true. That's this altered state, this Enlightenment. And hence the French philosophies led by Voltaire, Diderot, Diderot, however you want to say his name. It's the T silent in French. They took great delight in ridiculing religion's absurdities in a very public way. And along different lines, Immanuel Kant effected an immense Copernican shift in Western epistemology by demonstrating that much, perhaps everything, that we think we know about the external world is in fact filtered through a priori categories of the mind, such as space, time, and causality. And so, in short, the human mind doesn't simply reflect the world like a mirror, it also actively constructs the world. Significantly, Kant also nicely defined enlightenment as the ability to think for oneself outside of all external authorities, including and especially religious authority. So enlightenment is that thing that dwells outside of religious authority. Can you have religion in your life? Can you get religion and get Jesus? Can you have all of that in your life and still have enlightenment? I think it's if you separate yourself, step outside the box. Like I told my old seminary professor, sometimes you have to step outside the box and look back in to ask the question, rather than filter everything in the universe around you through what's inside the box. So, enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from something else or another. Self-incurred is this tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Have courage to use your own reason. That's the motto of enlightenment. Saperiaude, which is more literally, dare to know. Be bold, be courageous, spark courage. We didn't do one today. But the idea with this, be bold and courageous. Step out and use your boldness, use your courageousness. And so dare to know something. Dare to do and act and believe and enlighten yourself on the basis of learning something else that nobody else told you you had to believe. Remember, I've said all along, I don't want to be told what to believe, although I don't mind being taught things, but don't tell me what I have to believe. Lead me to the tools I need to decide what to believe. I don't need to be told. I want to discover it. And so this whole thing about enlightenment is man's release from self-incurred tutelage. Dare to know. But this reason remains this troubled and unstable place. Hence, alongside these developments that involve faith, seeking understanding, and a daring reason freeing itself from all external authorities, another more intuitive and perhaps even a bit poetic strand has always been present. One with deep roots in Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and the ebbs and flows of Western esotericism, such as knowing recognized the limits of any autonomous reason, even as it insisted on its own forms of more immediate knowledge. In the early modern period, this gnosis, this knowledge, surfaced dramatically within the Christian theosophy of Jacob Boehme, and was later taken up and developed in different directions by the Romantic poets and the German idealist philosophers. Thus began a centuries-long project of self-exploration. Bohemians, Jerome Boehme, they were known as Bohemians. That's where you get the radical, long-haired Bohemian types. And so this began this project of this self-exploration and naturalizing the supernatural. Taking the things that we called and respected and trusted as being supernatural and bringing them down and say they're all natural. I said a very long time, unwittingly and unknowing of this philosophical foundations to all this stuff, I said, I don't believe a supernatural exists. I said, I believe everything, even the things we refer to as supernatural or paranormal or all of this, are not really outside the normal. They're not really outside the natural. They're all natural. They're all normal, along with what we would consider normal life, because they all exist in this universe. So the universe was no longer simply a ticking clock, as it was for the deists and the early scientists. It now became a living poem, a cosmic epiphany, or a grand and gradual manifestation of an evolving Geist, zeitgeist, spirit awakening into its own divinity. So similar, essentially aesthetic and phenomenological sensibilities were translated into the churches and entered the study of religion primarily through early figures of guys like Friedrich Schleiermacher, The German say that fast when you have a sinus infection. Schleiermacher. The German theologian who evoked this deeply felt piety and individual experience and emotion as the truest and most reliable places to locate a legitimate religious life for skeptical moderns in his On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. And he wrote that in 1799. So it's an old book. And with this turn to the subjective realm, and he could even imagine one developing a religion of one's all on one's own, Schleiermacher opened up a way for what would later become the heavy, philosophical, psychological accent of the study of religion. And it was developed by such thinkers as Sigmund Freud, William James, Carl Jung, each of whom was also deeply interested in physical or mystical matters. And faith and reason and gnosis were all a part of this. Then we enter the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Now, you've heard these things for, that's a postmodern existential explanation. Now, most of us, that goes right over our head. We go, I don't care what he's saying. But let's look at that for a minute. The pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. So another very useful way to think about the study of religion is through a second triad, that of the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Remember we said faith, good grief, faith, reason, and gnosis. Now we're going to look at modern, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. Now all of these terms are in fact hotly contested in the academy, and it should be approached as useful fictions. But for our purposes here, we might as well define them as follows. Listen to this. Premodernity, pre-modern. It refers to a form. Now get this in your heads, because it's going to come up. Somebody's going to ask you someday. You're thinking as you're listening to this, I'm never going to use this. It's fun to listen to, but let's talk over here. But listen to this, because next week, as soon as you're done with this, saying that you are never going to use this, but somebody's going to ask you, hey, are you a pre-modernist or modern or a postmodernist? So pre-modernity, being a pre-modernist, refers to a form of the human consciousness that we assume was more or less common before the 16th century in the West. That is, before the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, pre all of that, you had I can't even say it. I can say pre-modernist, but I can't say pre-modernity. Pre-modernity existed. Pre-modern thought existed. All right? There we go. Boom. And it's still quite common in traditional societies that aren't heavily influenced by Western forms of thought and experience. Such a consciousness relies heavily on faith and belief to organize the world. This is pre-modern thinking. You rely very heavily on faith to form your belief system. And it forms your quintessential modern values, such as democracy, the freedom of intellectual, artistic, political, and religious expression, and the inviolability, for Pete's sake, of human rights are relatively foreign to these cultures and the attending forms of consciousness, such as values. So if truly honored and carried through to their logical conclusions, would dissolve many of the communal social forms that lie at the base of these pre-modern worldviews. This is where consciousness relies heavily on faith and belief to organize the world. On the positive side of being pre-modern in your thinking, pre-modern forms of thought and life offered human beings something more modern forms seldom can, and that is intimate forms of community and relative certainty about how the world works. I used to say when I was very steeped in the fundamental Baptist Church and evangelical Christianity. My community, my world, everything around me had a relative certainty about how it worked. There weren't many questions. The world was very small. So some of us might be appalled at the illusory and often dangerous nature of such certainties. But it's not difficult to see why the fundamentalist religious communities, themselves complex and unstable combinations of pre-modern and modern forms of religiosity, are constantly building larger parking lots, while liberal communities are shrinking. Literal beliefs and high walls of ideological intolerance ensure strong community, whereas openness and toleration render specific faith communities more or less irrelevant. And if everyone shares in the truth of things, why belong to this community and not some other? Indeed, why belong at all? So that's the pre-modern approach. Let's look at the modern approach now, or modernity. On the other hand, it refers to a form of human consciousness that's heavily inflected by an autonomous reason and the rational ordering of human life in all of its modes. It tends to privilege the individual over the community. It rejects religious appeals to transcendence. It looks to science as the standard of all these reliable truths that are out there, and knowledge. Democracy, the nation state, capitalism, and science have been the dominant expressions of this modernity. And although there have certainly been religious modernists as well, the Protestant Reformation, for example, is emblematic here, to the extent that it began the slow process of liberating the individual from the authority of faith and privileging the same individual's critical capacities and economic concerns in every area of thought and life. And such Protestant pillars of faith as the priesthood of all the believers. If you've been in evangelical Christianity, you'll know what the priesthood of the believers is. That's saying we're all priests in God's eyes. The absolute authority of the Scripture, interpreted by the individual, sola scriptura, were certainly religious ideas, but they also encoded all these profound transformations of political thought away from religious authority and toward the freedom and independence of the individual readers. And so it's not for nothing that individuals like William Tyndale were actually burned at the stake in the 16th century for translating the Bible into vernacular language. In Tyndale's case, he was one of the first to translate the Bible into English, so English speakers could actually read it. That's why you went to church and mass and you listened to the priest speaking, and he would read the scripture in Latin and tell you what it meant, through the filter of the church, of course. Well, Tyndale was burned at the stake for saying that people should be able to understand Scripture in their own language. And by this act, they were all opening the biblical texts up to interpretation, and well beyond the control of the church authorities. Oh my goodness, God's word wasn't meant only for church authorities to interpret for you? You mean you could pick up the Bible and read it for yourself? This was heresy. This was blasphemy, and this is why Tyndale, especially, as an example, was burned at the stake in the 16th century, in the 1500s. They were all, in effect, setting the foundations for the collapse of the medieval pre-modern worldview and the birth of the modern one. The modern study of religion began at the fires of the stake. Now that takes us to postmodernity. Postmodern thinking. This refers most generally to what comes after modernity. The lack of a developed definition is intentional here. Although the expression is a very recent one, postmodernist thinking. I was once accused by a Byzantine priest of using postmodernist thinking. It's a relatively new way to describe this. As you can look back the past 50 years of critical theory, and many thinkers would trace the contemporary roots of the postmodern back to Friedrich Nietzsche's prophetic writings on the death of God, the aesthetic celebration of a Dionysian sexual spirituality beyond good and evil, and the rejection of all philosophical or religious foundations, what Martin Heidegger would later simply condemn as ontotheology, or cancerous theology. Significantly for our purposes anyway here, Nietzsche's texts as postmodernist origins are often imbued with a very distinct homoerotic passion and a zeal of mystical. Did I lisp after talking about homoerotic? Mystical fury. He was not a self-confessed devotee of Dionysus and the mysteries of sexuality for nothing. Nietzschean origins aside, as a technical term, postmodernity, postmodernist thinking, refers to a form of human consciousness that seeks to move beyond the autonomous reason of modernity and to talk of stable essences, laws, structures, into a different, presumably much more hopeful or workable human future. This it attempts through a rejection of any talk of metaphysical essences of religion, meaning any kind of spirituality, hocus-pocus stuff, or ontological foundations, claims of the effective death of the stable subject, the individual of modernity. See, I can't even say it with the word modern. Modernity. Modern thinking. Modernist thinking. I don't even know why I wrote that down that way. So, it's a rejection of all the meta narratives that are out there, those big stories, the big mythologies such as Christianity, evolutionary science, or history as social progress that provided the context for the legitimate meaning within modern cultures, and a celebration of plurality, alterarity or otherness, and above all, difference, sameness, form, essence are all forbidden terms in postmodernist thinking. So perhaps most important, through postmodern forms of thought are radically reflexive. That is, they're profoundly aware of their own cognitive processes. And so often they double back on themselves through the genres of confession, autobiography, irony, and even parody. Still within this same reflexive move, a recognizable relativism or perspectivalism, perspectivalism also pervades postmodern thought. That is, the insistence that what we call truth is really a function of the power and the perspective of the knower, and not an accurate reflection of some objective external reality independent of the human observer. In other words, that's saying everything is relative, or that truth is in the eye of the beholder, is a postmodernist way of thinking. In this sense, postmodernity, I don't know why I keep trying to say it. I wrote it this way. I don't know why I keep trying to say it. In this sense, postmodernism of Kantian modernism is what this really is, if that makes sense to you, if you've been following along. And in many places, moreover, postmodern thought radicalizes this relativism further into what we might call this complete constructivism. That is, the position that human cultures actually create or construct the worlds that human beings live in through elaborate processes involving language, the use of words, concepts, ideas, religious beliefs, rituals, and social organization. Now, y'all got that? Test tomorrow. This is the way that modern culture has formed its view of religious thought. So are you a pre-modernist? Are you a modernist? Are you a postmodernist? Maybe you didn't catch enough of all that to go, what was the middle one again? So let's keep going on this and see where is your gnosis? Where's your knowledge? What do you believe? Maybe some of us are going, I believe this. I don't think about any of that bullshit you just said. Well, this is the way philosophical thought, scientific thought will break down why people think the way they think, why we believe the things we believe. And so now we're going to look toward this Gnostic modernism. Let me take a drink, though, first. That should actually be a shot after all of that. So now we're going to dig into this more, break it down some more. We've only got a couple of minutes left tonight, but let's start this look towards Gnostic and modernity. I keep trying to say the word, don't I? Postmodernism. Gnostic postmodernism. Now, given these two fictive triads, faith on one side with reason and gnosis, faith, reason, and gnosis, and pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, we might want to say that as a function of modernism and its cognitive dilemmas, the study of religion shares in both pre-modern and modern forms of consciousness, even as it continually strives for something more, better, after, and in effect a kind of Gnostic postmodernism. One might want to say that, but I'm not yet entirely convinced that I do. So what this is all about, where we're going to pick this up on Monday, we're going to talk about these things. Faith, reason, and gnosis versus modern, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. What are you thinking? Why is it even important to think this way? What is your gnosis? Let's kind of use that as our call for catchphrase, our catch question for this series. What's your gnosis? We're going to come back and we're going to look more on the serpent's gift on Monday and more about all of this stuff and how we interpret these things in who we are today. All right, guys, thanks for listening. You guys will have a good weekend. We'll see you again on Sunday morning with It's Sunday with Scotty and Rainey. Rainey, if she's well enough. And if not, it'll be just me. And a totally different kind of show. Hit the join button. Check out the memberships if you haven't already. Join up. Have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday. Good night.